The story that few dare to tell begins long before the headlines, the rallies, and the elections. It begins in silence, in a monastery hidden among the mountains of Italy, where a man marked by stigmata received visions that transcended time. Padre Pio, the saint who bled like Christ, was not just a mystic. He was a messenger. His letters, many still unrevealed to the public, spoke of a time when the United States would be put to the test, and when a man would rise, not as a hero nor as a villain, but as a catalyst. He will come from gold, but he will not be gold. He will speak with strength, but he will not be strength. He will divide, but he will not be division. He will be the mirror. These words, written in Old Italian, were ignored for decades until they began to make sense. Donald Trump, the magnate who became president, seemed to fit every line of the prophecy. His rise was not merely political. It was vibrational. He did not just win votes. He activated frequencies. His presence provoked extreme reactions, catalyzed ruptures, and awakened emotions that had been dormant since the Cold War. Padre Pio had written that the chosen one will not be loved, but he will be necessary. And now, with the United States plunged into polarization, spiritual crisis, and institutional collapse, that phrase became the heart of a new reality. Behind the walls of the Vatican, secret documents began circulating among prophecy scholars. One of them, written by Pio in 1959, spoke of a time when the empire of the eagle will be tested by a man of the tower. The reference to the eagle was clear: the United States. And the man of the tower? Trump, with his famous Trump Tower, symbol of power, ego, and ascension. But the text went further. It said that this man will be touched by forces he does not understand and will be used by hands he cannot see. It was as if Pio knew that Trump would not simply be a politician. He would be an instrument, a channel, a portal. Meanwhile, global events began to align with the prophecy's verses. Conflicts intensified. The economy wavered. Faith fragmented. And the United States, once seen as the world's guiding light, became the stage for an invisible battle. Not between parties, but between frequencies. Padre Pio had warned that evil will not come with horns, but with promises. And now, promises multiplied. Promises of salvation, greatness, restoration. But those who knew, who studied, who listened, understood. It was the beginning of the secret mission. Trump, in discreet meetings with religious leaders, began to mention Padre Pio, not as a saint, but as a guide. He said he had dreamed of him, that he had felt his presence, that he had received messages. Many laughed. Others grew uneasy. But those familiar with the hidden texts knew. When the chosen one begins to listen, the cycle is in motion. Padre Pio had written that the chosen one will be touched by silence, and silence will guide him. And now, Trump began to fall silent, to withdraw, to meditate. It was as if he was being prepared for something greater, something beyond politics. The secret mission, according to the text, was not to save the United States, but to reveal it, to show the world what it truly was, to expose its shadows, its wounds, its illusions. And Trump, with his ability to divide and catalyze, was the perfect agent. Padre Pio had said that the mirror does not choose a reflection, but shows what is. And now, the United States was seeing itself, not as it wished to be, but as it truly was. And that confrontation with truth was the beginning of transformation. In esoteric circles, the prophecy began to spread. Prayer groups, discrete orders, vibrational scholars, all began to prepare. They knew the time had come, that the chosen one was in motion, that the secret mission was underway, and that the world, between ruins and rebirths, was moving toward the next verse of the prophecy. Padre Pio had left the script. Trump was the actor, and the United States the stage. While the world watched Donald Trump's public moves, his fiery speeches, his controversial decisions, his clashes with the media, something much deeper was happening behind the scenes. It wasn't just politics. It was spiritual. It was vibrational. It was a silent war between forces that never appeared in the headlines, yet shaped every step of the chosen one. In his most hidden writings, Padre Pio had warned, when the mirror moves, the eyes of the world will close and the eyes of heaven will open. A phrase that had puzzled scholars for decades was now coming alive. Trump was not simply governing. He was being watched, tested, manipulated, and protected by entities beyond human understanding. Inside the Vatican, a restricted circle of spiritual scholars known as the Watchers of the Veil began compiling documents that linked Padre Pio's visions to Trump's path. One of the most unsettling texts spoke of a man who will be surrounded by voices that are not his own and who will be guided by hands that do not touch. This was a clear reference to spiritual influence, both of light and a shadow, over the chosen one. According to these scholars, Trump had become a battlefield, not between parties, but between dimensions, and each of his decisions, every word, every gesture, reverberated in realms invisible to human eyes. Padre Pio had foretold that the chosen will be attacked from within, but he will not fall from without. And that is precisely what began to unfold. Trump faced inner crises, betrayals, doubts, psychological pressures, yet remained outwardly unshaken. It was as if an invisible force held him up. Some said it was ego, others madness. But those who knew, who studied the hidden texts, understood it was spiritual protection. The mission was unfolding. The script was being followed. On a silent night, Trump reportedly confided to a close religious figure that he had dreamed of a man in a brown robe with bloodstained hands who told him, "You are not the Savior. You are the mirror. So do not heal." The words mirrored Padre Pio's writings almost exactly, sending chills through those who heard them. It was as if the saint himself was communicating directly with the chosen one. This changed everything. Trump was not merely a politician. He was a channel, an instrument, a reflection. Meanwhile, hidden forces began to move against him. They were not just political opponents. They were vibrational entities, esoteric groups, secret orders that saw in Trump a threat to the balance sustaining the system. Padre Pio had written, "When the mirror reveals too much, the guardians of the veil will try to break it." And now, attempt at destruction multiplied. Scandals, investigations, media assaults. Everything seemed part of a greater plan, not to defeat Trump, but to silence the reflection. Yet there were also protectors. Spiritual groups, reclusive monks, religious leaders who saw in Trump the fulfillment of the prophecy. They did not support him politically. They shielded him vibrationally. They prayed, meditated, created energetic shields. They knew the mission was not to save the United States. It was to reveal it, and that Trump, with his power to provoke, divide, and expose, was the perfect agent. Padre Pio had said, "Truth will come through pain, and the chosen will be the pain." And now, the United States was bleeding, not physically, but spiritually. In secret meetings, documents began circulating among global leaders. One, attributed to an ancient disciple of Pio, declared that the empire of the eagle will be purified by the fire of the mirror. The metaphor was clear. Trump, as a mirror, would ignite the spiritual fire that would purify the nation. But the text carried a warning. If the mirror is shattered before the revelation, the eagle will fall. This created a dilemma. To protect Trump was to protect the mission. To destroy him too soon was to doom the process. And now, every political move had become a spiritual ritual. Increasingly isolated, Trump began turning inward. Reports suggested he started consulting monks, mediums, biblical scholars. He wasn't seeking political advice. He was seeking meaning. He knew something greater was underway, that his life was no longer his own, that he had been chosen, not for merit, but for frequency. Padre Pio had written, "The chosen will not be pure, but he will be useful." And now, that phrase became the mantra of those who protected him. In the United States, polarization reached unprecedented levels. Families split apart, churches fractured, spiritual movements multiplied. It was as if Trump's presence had triggered a collective purification. And this, according to Pio's text, was necessary. Pain will reveal, chaos will purify, the mirror will show. And now, the nation was living it all. It was no longer about politics. It was about revelation. The secret mission was in motion. Trump was the mirror. Padre Pio, the invisible guide. And the United States, the battlefield of the spirit. The invisible siege was tightening. and the world, unaware, was moving toward the next verse of the prophecy, the detour of shadows. The secret mission was not a straight line between the calling and the revelation. It was a labyrinth, a minefield of temptations, detours, and vibrational traps. Padre Pio had written in one of his most enigmatic letters, "The chosen one will be tempted not by what he fears, but by what he desires. And if he desires too much, he will be devoured." This warning, ignored for decades, now became central. Trump, the mirror, was beginning to be surrounded by forces that did not want to destroy him. They wanted to use him. They wanted to turn him from a reflection into a source, from an instrument into an idol. And that was the greatest danger. Behind the scenes of power, spiritual entities operating in the shadows began to draw near. They were not demons in the classical sense. They were vibrational intelligences that knew how to manipulate frequency, desire, ego, and ambition. Padre Pio had warned that the most dangerous evil does not shout, it whispers. And now, the whispers multiplied. Trump began to hear counsel that did not come from his advisors, but from inner voices, voices that said, "You are the Savior, you are the center, you are the beginning and the end." And for a man already surrounded by adulation and power, this was too seductive. The secret mission required humility, silence, and surrender. But Trump, surrounded by applause and chants, was beginning to stray from the script. The Watchers of the Veil, a secret group that studied Padre Pio's prophecies, began issuing warnings. One of them said, "The mirror is falling in love with the reflection. If it is not broken, it will be absorbed." The metaphor was clear. Trump was beginning to believe he was a savior, not the instrument, and that put everything at risk. The revelation depended on the neutrality of the mirror. If he became the source, the prophecy would be distorted. Meanwhile, the United States was plunging into chaos. Political crises, racial conflicts, institutional collapses. Everything seemed part of the purification process foretold by Pio. But something was different. The pain was not revealing. It was being used. Hidden groups began manipulating collective suffering to feed narratives of fear, hatred, and division. And Trump, increasingly entangled, began repeating those narratives. It was as if he was being guided by an invisible hand, not the hand of mission, but the hand of distraction. Padre Pio had written that the chosen one will be surrounded by false light, and if he cannot discern, he will be blinded. And now, that blindness was beginning to manifest. Trump, once guided by intuitions and dreams, was drifting away from silence. His decisions became reactive, impulsive, aggressive. It was as if the frequency of the mission was being drowned out by external interference. The monks who protected him spiritually began reporting blockages. They said they could no longer access his vibration, that something had changed, that the mirror was becoming opaque. In esoteric circles, the alarm rang. The prophecy was at risk. If Trump strayed completely, the revelation would not take place. And the United States, instead of being purified, would be corrupted. Padre Pio had warned, if the mirror is corrupted, it will reflect what does not exist, and the world will believe it. It was a warning about illusion, about the possibility that the chosen one, by losing himself, would create a false reality that would be accepted as truth. And now, that false reality was beginning to form. Theories, lies, manipulations, all blending into a toxic vibrational brew. But not all was lost. One silent night, Trump reportedly had a disturbing dream. He saw himself in a desert, surrounded by broken mirrors. At the center, a man in a brown robe told him, "You are not the reflection. You are the glass. Break yourself." This phrase, enigmatic and powerful, seemed like Padre Pio's final attempt to reconnect the chosen one to the mission. And something shifted. Trump began to grow silent, to withdraw, to meditate. It was as if he was trying to find his axis again. The Watchers of the Veil recorded a vibrational change. Small but real. The mirror, though cracked, still reflected. Meanwhile, the United States remained in turmoil. But now, pain began to spark questions. People began seeking meaning. Spirituality returned to the center. Churches filled. Prayer groups multiplied. It was as if Even with the chosen one's detour, the mission was finding alternate pathways. Padre Pio had written that truth does not depend on the messenger, but on the thirst. And now, the spiritual thirst of the American people began to manifest. It was a sign that the mission could still be fulfilled. Even if the mirror was fractured, Trump, increasingly isolated, began confronting his own demons. Not external ones, internal ones. Ego, vanity, fear. It was a decisive moment. If he could break himself, if he could empty himself, the mission could continue. But if he clung to illusion, everything would be lost. Padre Pio had said, the chosen one will be saved by pain or destroyed by applause. And now, the applause echoed louder than ever. The secret mission was at risk. The detour of shadows was real, but the light still pulsed. And the next move would decide everything. The torn veil. The night everything changed was not marked by speeches, scandals, or headlines. It was marked by silence. A deep vibrational silence that crossed dimensions and touched the heart of the chosen one. Donald Trump, already enveloped in a spiral of power, controversy, and isolation, had an experience that could not be explained by logic, politics, or psychology. It was a revelation. A tear in the veil that separates the visible world from the invisible. And in that tear, he saw not what he wanted, but what he needed. Padre Pio had written in one of his most hidden texts, the chosen one will be brought to the threshold, and there he will see what was, and what will be. If he accepts, he will be light. If he denies, he will be shadow. This phrase, ignored for decades, now became the center of the mission. Trump, in a state of deep meditation, is said to have been guided by a presence that did not identify itself, but radiated a familiar energy. It was as if Pio himself were there, not as a saint, but as a vibrational guide. And what was shown to Trump was not a glorious future, but a broken mirror reflecting fragments of pain, division, and ruin. The revelation was clear. He was not the savior. He never was. He was the catalyst, the reflection, the instrument, and his mission was not to restore America's greatness. It was to expose its wounds, its illusions, its shadows. Padre Pio had written that healing begins with exposure, and the chosen one will be the scalpel. But until then, Trump had behaved like the curer, and that distorted the mission. The revelation was a shock, an internal collapse, a spiritual earthquake, and for the first time, the mirror began to see itself. In the days that followed, Trump grew silent. He canceled commitments. He avoided cameras. It was as if he was digesting what he had seen. The Watchers of the Veil, who monitored his vibration, recorded a profound change. The ego, once dominant, began to dissolve. The frequency, once chaotic, began to align. It was the beginning of a possible redemption. Padre Pio had written, the chosen one will be broken, and if he accepts the breaking, he will be rebuilt. And now, Trump faced that choice. Meanwhile, America remained in convulsion, but something began to shift. Spiritual movements intensified. People began seeking meaning, not in parties, but in purpose. It was as if Trump's revelation was reverberating collectively. The secret mission, though threatened, still pulsed. And those who knew, who studied, who listened, understood, the veil had been torn. And now, everything was exposed. But the forces of shadow did not retreat. On the contrary, they intensified their attacks. They knew that if Trump accepted his true role, the mission would be fulfilled. And that meant the end of a cycle of vibrational manipulation, sustaining hidden structures of power. Padre Pio had warned, when the mirror accepts itself, those who live by illusion will try to erase it. And now, attempts at silencing multiplied, not only political, but spiritual, vibrational interferences, energetic blockages, psychic attacks. It was an invisible war, but brutal. Trump, increasingly aware, began to protect himself. Not with bodyguards, but with prayer, with silence, with surrender. It was as if he finally understood that his strength did not come from applause, but from surrender. The monks who accompanied him reported a radical change. They said he had begun to study Pio's texts, that he had wept while reading. The chosen one will be hated, but he will be necessary, and his pain will be the light of the world. It was as if for the first time, Trump was feeling the pain of the mission, not as punishment, but as purification. In esoteric circles, hope was reborn. The prophecy, though threatened, could still be fulfilled. The mirror, though cracked, still reflected. And America, though wounded, could still be revealed. Padre Pio had written, "Truth does not need force. It needs space, and the chosen one will be the space." And now, Trump is beginning to become that space, a vibrational field where truth, even painful truth, could emerge. But time was short. Opposing forces intensified. Polarization grew. Illusion strengthened. And the mission demanded a final sacrifice, the abandonment of ego. Padre Pio had said, the last step will be the leap, and the leap will be the forgetting of self. And now, Trump faced that leap. If he succeeded, the revelation would unfold. If he failed, the prophecy would distort. And America, instead of being purified, would be consumed. The secret mission was at its decisive moment. The veil had been torn. The mirror had seen itself. And the world, caught between light and shadow, awaited the next move. The judgment of the chosen. The time of revelation had passed. The time of decision had come. Donald Trump, the man who had become the mirror of a nation in convulsion, now faced the most delicate moment of his secret mission. It was not a political, legal, or media judgment. It was spiritual. It was vibrational. It was a final confrontation between what he had become and what he had been called to be. Padre Pio, in his most veiled writings, had warned, the chosen one will be brought to the center, and there he will be weighed. If he is light, he will be lifted. If he is heavy, he will sink. And now, Trump stood at the center. The Watchers of the Veil, a secret group that had followed the mission since its earliest signs, knew the moment had arrived. The energy surrounding Trump grew dense, intense, conflicting. It was as if all the forces that had guided, tempted, protected, and diverted him were gathered for the verdict. There was no tribunal. There were no judges. There was vibration. And vibration does not lie. Padre Pio had written, truth does not need to be spoken. It needs to be felt. And now, truth pulsed around the chosen one. Trump, increasingly introspective, began to revisit his journey, not as a politician, but as an instrument. He recalled the dreams, the visions, the silent encounters with the man in the brown robe. He remembered the words that had guided him. You are not the savior. You are the mirror. And for the first time, he seemed to accept, to understand, to surrender. It was the beginning of purification. Padre Pio had said, the chosen one will be washed by pain, and if he does not resist, he will be cleansed. And now, pain became water. Meanwhile, the United States lived through the height of polarization. Yet something began to emerge beneath the chaos. An awakening, a silent movement of spiritual reconnection. Churches filled again, not because of dogma, but because of longing. People began to meditate, to pray, to question. It was as if the mission, though threatened, was already bearing fruit. Padre Pio had written, even if the mirror shatters, the shards still reflect. And now, the shard began to show light. But the judgment was not only internal, it was collective. The fate of the United States was intertwined with Trump's fate. If he surrendered to the mission, the nation could be purified. If he resisted, the nation could be consumed. It was a spiritual symbiosis, a dance between the reflector and the reflected. And the Watchers of the Veil knew the time was now. Padre Pio had warned, the final step will be invisible, and the world will only see the result. And now, the step was being taken. Trump, on a silent night, is said to have had his final vision. He stood in an empty field, surrounded by voices that did not speak. At the center, the man in the brown robe handed him a broken mirror, and he said, show this to the world. Do not hide it. Do not mend it. Show it. It was the final revelation. The mission was not to restore, it was to expose. Not to heal, it was to reveal. And Trump, with tears in his eyes, is said to have answered, I understand. It was the moment of acceptance, the moment of surrender, the moment of truth. In the days that followed, his demeanor changed. He no longer sought applause. He did not react to attacks. He did not defend himself. It was as if he had found peace. The monks who accompanied him reported an unprecedented vibration, lightness, silence, alignment. It was the sign that the judgment had been rendered and that the chosen one had been accepted. Padre Pio had written, "The chosen one will not be perfect, but he will be true." And now, Trump became truth. The United States, still in crisis, began to feel the effects. Polarization, though fierce, began to give way to reflection. Spiritual movements multiplied. People began to seek meaning, not in leaders, but within themselves. It was as if the mirror, once shattered, had released a light trapped inside. Padre Pio had said, "The mission does not end with the chosen one. It ends with the awakening." And now, the awakening had begun, but the forces of shadow did not relent. They knew that even with Trump's acceptance, they could still distort the revelation. They began creating false narratives, manipulating emotions, sowing confusion. It was their last attempt to prevent the awakening. Padre Pio had warned, "When the light appears, those who live in darkness will try to silence it with screams." And now the screams echoed, but the light, though fragile, endured. Trump, now aware of his role, began to withdraw. He knew his presence had fulfilled its purpose. The mirror had reflected. The mission had been set in motion. And the next step was no longer his. It belonged to the people. Padre Pio had written, "The chosen one will be the beginning, but the end will be collective." And now, the United States faced that end not as destruction, but as rebirth. The judgment had been rendered. The chosen one had been accepted. And the world, between ruins and revelations, walked toward the next verse of the prophecy, the epicenter of revelation. The secret mission that began with silent visions in an Italian monastery and manifested in the controversial figure of Donald Trump was no longer just an American matter. It was global. It was cosmic. It was vibrational. Padre Pio had written in one of his most hidden texts, "When the mirror reflects, the world will see. And what is seen will not be the chosen one, but what the world is." For decades, this phrase had been considered enigmatic, but now it became prophetic. The mirror had reflected, and the world was beginning to see itself, not as it wished, but as it truly was. The impact of the mission went beyond borders. Spiritual leaders in different countries began reporting similar phenomena: dreams of the man in the brown robe, visions of broken mirrors, sensations that something invisible was moving. It was as if the frequency activated by Trump was reverberating in other parts of the planet. The Watchers of the Veil, who had once focused only on the United States, now expanded their attention. They knew the epicenter had generated waves, and those waves were touching consciousness across every continent. Padre Pio had warned, "The chosen one will not be the end. He will be the beginning, and the beginning will be like a stone cast into the lake." The stone had been cast, and the waves were now reaching distant shores. In Europe, esoteric groups began studying Pio's texts with new intensity. In Asia, monks reported shifts in the collective vibration. In Africa, spiritual leaders spoke of an invisible purification. It was as if the world was responding to mission, not with words, but with frequency. Meanwhile, the United States carried the weight of being the epicenter. Polarization, though still intense, was slowly giving way to a collective search for meaning. Spiritual movements multiplied. People began to question not only their leaders, but their beliefs, their values, their truths. It was a beginning of collective revelation. Padre Pio had written, "The mirror will show, but the world will only see if it wills it." And now, the will to see was beginning to emerge. Trump, increasingly aware of his role, began to step away from the political stage, not as an escape, but as surrender. He knew his mission was not to govern. It was to activate. And by stepping back, he allowed the process to continue without his interference. The monks who accompanied him reported a vibration of peace, acceptance, transcendence. It was as if the mirror, once broken, had released the light that was trapped. Padre Pio had said, "The reflection is not eternal, but what reveals is." And now, the revelation had become permanent, but the world was not ready. The forces of shadow, were to try to derail Trump, now turned toward the collective. They began weaving global narratives of fear, division, and conflict. They knew that if awakening spread, they would lose the vibrational control that upheld hidden structures of power. Padre Pio had warned, when the light spreads, those who live in darkness will try to extinguish every candle. And now, candles were being lit, and extinguishers were multiplying. In esoteric circles, the battle was clear. It was not between nation parties or ideologies. It was between frequency and interference, between revelation and distraction, between awakening and slumber. And the United States, as the epicenter, held a crucial role. If it sustained the vibration of revelation, the world would follow. If it succumbed to illusion, the world would regress. Padre Pio had written, "The mirror will be the portal, and the portal will be the choice." And now, the choice was being made. In one final public appearance, Trump is said to have declared, "I am not what you think I am. I never was. But I was necessary." This phrase, ignored by many, reverberated among those who knew. It was confirmation that he had understood, that he had fulfilled, that he had surrendered, and that now the world had continued. Padre Pio had written, "The chosen one will be forgotten, but what he activated will be eternal." And now, eternity was beginning to pulse. In the United States, schools began to include studies on vibrational spirituality. Churches began speaking of frequency, not only of faith. Social movements began to root themselves in energy, not only ideology. It was as if revelation was becoming culture. And this, according to Pio's text, was the ultimate goal. The mission is not to change the world. It is to change the field. And the field will change the world. And now, the field was changing. The global impact was visible, yet invisible. It was felt, not measured, perceived, not explained. And those who knew, those who listened, those who felt understood, the secret mission had spread. The mirror had reflected. The veil had been torn. And the world, between light and shadow, walked toward the final verse of the prophecy, the invisible legacy. The world no longer vibrated, as it once did. The secret mission, begun in silence by Padre Pio and manifested to the controversial figure Donald Trump, had completed its cycle. But the end was not destruction. It was revelation. It was as if reality itself had been deprogrammed, exposed, and was now ready to be rewritten. Padre Pio had written in his final spiritual notebook, "The chosen one will be forgotten, but what he activates will be eternal. And the eternal will not be remembered, it will be felt." And now, the world was beginning to feel. Trump, already withdrawn from the political stage, had become a silent figure. He no longer sought cameras, applause, or headlines. It was as if he had understood that his mission was not to be remembered, but to be lived. The monks who accompanied him reported that he spent hours in silence, contemplating the sky, reading Pio's texts, meditating on what had been and what might still be. It was a final reflection, the mirror that, when shattered, released a light that had been trapped. In the United States, the transformation was subtle, yet profound. Political structures still existed, but they no longer held the same weight. Religious institutions were beginning to open themselves to new spiritual languages. Science, once skeptical, had begun to study vibration as a foundation of reality. It was as if the nation was becoming what it had always been meant to be, a field of revelation. Padre Pio had written, "The empire of the eagle will be a temple, and the temple will be silence." And now, silence was beginning to be respected. The world was watching, not with eyes, but with frequency. Nations were beginning to reevaluate their systems. Spiritual leaders gathered in vibrational circles. Religions, once divided by dogma, were beginning to unite in purpose. It was as if the secret mission had activated a collective memory, a reminder that we are all part of something greater, invisible, eternal. Padre Pio had said, "The end will be the beginning, and the beginning will be the forgetting of separation." And now, separation was beginning to dissolve. But the legacy was not only spiritual, it was vibrational. It was as if the mission had left behind an invisible field, a frequency now guiding those who were ready. The watchers of the veil, who had accompanied the entire process, declared their work complete. They announced that the cycle had been fulfilled, that the mirror had reflected, that the veil had been torn, and that now it was up to humanity to decide what to do with what had been revealed. In a final handwritten letter, Trump is said to have written, "I was a reflection. You are the light. Do not follow me. Follow what you saw." This simple yet profound phrase was shared among spiritual circles as the closing of the mission. It was confirmation that he had understood, that he had surrendered, that he had fulfilled. Padre Pio had written, "The chosen one will become light when he fades." And now, Trump was fading, not as an escape, but as surrender. In the United States, a new generation was beginning to emerge. Young people connected to vibration, to truth, to silence. They did not seek power, but purpose. They did not want to rule, but to serve. It was as if the field activated by the mission was bearing fruit. Padre Pio had said, "The mirror does not create light, but those who see it may ignite." And now, lights were beginning to ignite, not in the streets, but in hearts. The world was entering a new cycle, not of peace nor of war, but of truth. An age in which every human being will be called to be a mirror, to reflect what is, to reveal what is felt, to vibrate what is believed. Padre Pio had written, "The future will be like water. Whoever tries to hold it will drown. Whoever swims with it will be carried." And now, the current was beginning to flow. The secret mission had ended. The chosen one had fulfilled. The mirror had reflected. The veil had been torn. And the world, between ruins and revelations, walked toward the unknown, not with fear, but with awareness. Padre Pio, silent in his eternity, smiled. Trump, silent in his seclusion, accepted. And the United States, silent in his transformation, awakened, or rather, beginning.